For lesson 3, we turn to that tried and true educational technique. Show a video by that brilliant Indian ancestry neuroscientist guy who we've seen before in class. You should give him some cut of the massive instructor and TA payment. He's become quieter.
Delusion. And that is a patient who's otherwise completely normal, who had a head injury, comes out of coma, otherwise completely normal. He looks at his mother and says, this looks exactly like my mother, this woman, but she's an imposter. She's some other woman pretending to be my mother. Now, why does this happen? Why would somebody, if this person is perfectly lucid and intelligent in all due respect, but when he sees his mother, this delusion kicks in and says, my mother. Now, the most common interpretation of this, which you find in older psychiatry textbooks, is a Freudian view. And that is that this chap, and the same argument applies to women, by the way, but I'll just talk about guys. When you're a little baby, when a young baby, you had a strong sexual attraction to your mother. This is the so-called Oedipus complex of Freud. I'm not saying I believe this, but this is the sort of standard Freudian view. And then as you grow up, the cortex develops and inhibits these latent sexual urges towards your mother. Thank God, otherwise we'd all be sexually aroused when you saw your mother. And then what happens is there's a blow to your head, damaging the cortex, allowing these latent sexual urges to emerge flaming to the surface, and suddenly and inexplicably, you find yourself being sexually aroused by your mother.
Don't drop the class right now. That's wrong.
You say, my God, this is my mom. How come I'm being sexually turned on? She's some other woman. She's an imposter. It's the only interpretation that makes sense to your damaged brain. This never made much sense to me, this argument. It's very ingenious, as all Freudian arguments are. Didn't make much sense because I have seen the same delusion, a patient having the same delusion about his pet poodle. He'll say, doctor, this is not Fifi. It looks exactly like Fifi, but it's some other dog, right? Now you try using the Freudian explanation there. You'll start talking about the latent bestiality in all humans or some such thing, which is quite absurd, of course. Now, what's really going on? So to explain this curious disorder, we looked at the structure and functions of the normal visual pathways in the brain. Normally, visual signals come into the eyeballs, go to the visual areas in the brain. There are, in fact, 30 areas in the back of your brain concerned with just vision. And after processing all that, the message goes to a small structure called a fusiform gyrus, where you perceive faces. There are neurons there that are sensitive to faces. You can call it the face area of the brain. Right? I talked about that earlier. Now, when that area is damaged, you lose the ability to see faces. Right? But from that area, the message cascades into a structure called the amygdala in the limbic system, the emotional core of the brain. And that structure called the amygdala gauges the emotional significance of what you're looking at. Is it prey? Is it predator? Is it mate? Or is it something utterly trivial like a piece of lint or a piece of chalk or I don't want to come to that, but or a shoe or something like that, okay? Which you can completely ignore. So if the amygdala is excited and this is something important, the message is then cascade into the autonomic nervous system. Your heart starts beating faster. You start sweating to dissipate the heat that you're going to create from exerting muscular exertion. And that's fortunate because we can put 2 electrodes on your palm and measure the change in skin resistance produced by sweating. So I can determine when you're looking at something whether you're excited or whether you're aroused or not. Okay? And I'll get to that in a minute. So my idea was when this chap looks at an object, when he looks at any object for that matter, it goes to visual areas, and however, when it's processed in the fusiform gyrus, and you recognize it as a pea plant or a table or your mother for that matter, okay? And then the message cascades into the amygdala and then goes down the autonomic nervous system. And maybe in this chap, that wire that goes from the amygdala to the limbic system, the emotional core of the brain, is cut by the accident.
Now, that was the point. Okay, so the phenomenon which opens the brain chapter, pardon me, I'll be turning momentarily, that opens the brain chapter is exactly this one. People who seem otherwise perfectly normal suddenly don't recognize, note, people or a dog in one case, they know extremely well. It's called Capgras delusion. It seems absolutely impossible, but it's not extremely common, but it's not like there's one case in the history of the world. The Where he ended off, though, is with this idea, though he did not say the word network, he didn't say that there was damage to a part of the brain. So what that little speech did, I'll do it by way of pictures here, is to say that your eye is up here somewhere, you know, it's out there, or there's an eye. So stuff comes in from the eye and it goes back here and it's processed. Please don't write down all the names that are here. Then the signals go to something called the fusiform gyrus. So if you notice that you're extraordinarily good at recognizing a particular thing, people, it's because evolution has given you a part of brain to do that. You know, even if you saw somebody once, it's possible to realize, oh, I saw her once at a party at UIC, which is an amazing bit of, I mean, of all human capability, perhaps the most amazing is the recognition that, oh, yeah, I met you once for 10 minutes at a train station a year and a half ago. Because people do look kind of similar. It's not like some of them have 8 eyes or something. Everybody looks a little the same. There's people all over the place. You're running into them all the time. There's more of them on TV. It'd be possible to imagine a world in which you totally forget meeting people before by sight, but instead we have a world in which you recognize people by sight really, really quickly. Even if there's like a big group of people, if one of them is somebody you know well in a photo, the person just pops right out. So there's processing that is incredibly good for faces. Over the course of evolution, it's obvious you needed that, because if you just ran off with the wrong tribe or family, that was bad, so evolution selected for this. Physically, it's the fusiform gyrus. But then what he points out is his argument, and then, of course, there's more data. I just stopped it to save time, is that in these patients, the fusiform gyrus must work fine because they recognize people who aren't there, like mother and father. It's also the case that the brain has a kind of emotional core, as he put it, an emotional subsystem. That works fine because the patient experiences emotions. So the oddity of this thing that's Capgras syndrome is 2 levels. One is that a weird thing happens. A small number of people fail to recognize like their mother or father. The other oddity is that that happens while they do recognize other people who aren't their mother and father, and otherwise have a normal mental and emotional life. The argument from Ramachandran, that's who that was, and with data, if we had kept going, is that there's a connection between the 2 areas, and somehow through injury or illness, that connection got broken. This is not speculative. We'll have pictures of brain connections up even before this class ends. But the brain contains cells that have long things that stick out, the axons of the cells that go from one part of the brain to another. It's quite possible for the connections, these axons that go from one part of the brain to another, to be interfered with by injury or illness. So normally when you see somebody you know well, your mother or father, you have 2 things: a facial expression, a facial image here and here, from vision to the fusiform gyrus, and an emotional feeling. Ah, it's good old mom, or geez, it's mom. But either way, there's some kind of emotional reaction and image at the same time. These patients with Capgras delusion get the image, don't get the emotion, and then draw the only conclusion that's logical. If somebody looks like but doesn't feel like your mother or father, the conclusion it's an imposter. And so they actually have this belief, incredibly, that the person who is their mother or father is actually an imposter. Not because any part individually of the brain isn't working, but because things aren't working together in a synchronized network way, which of course is then lesson, what the heck was that? Lesson 3, which is that the brain doesn't just look like this with parts, but looks more like this. This little technology on the bottom, I don't know if you've seen this before, it didn't exist until like 5 years ago. So, I mean, it's good you didn't take the class 5 years ago. You wouldn't have had this wonderful textbook, and the parts of the brain, it wouldn't look like the brain. It contains a surface area with these parts. But this kind of picture of the brain looks almost archaic now, because you look at these parts and it's really not obvious like how all this really complex stuff is happening, like conscious experience. The stuff is happening because there's all this other stuff. That this incredibly interconnected, here's another one, like this network of stuff. So it's never the case that like one little part of the brain is firing while you're doing a calculus problem. Tons of parts of the brain are firing, and in almost perfect synchrony, maybe asynchronized by just milliseconds, because they're all like hyper-net. I guess I don't really need to add more, do I? A few more over here. Because they're all super networked. The technology for doing this, if you already read ahead a bit, what's happening is that it's imaging the connections from one part of the brain to another through these axons, and this technology, the fusion tensor imaging, must have just been invented in the 21st century. I'd never seen images like this until 5 or 6 years ago. But they quickly revolutionized the understanding of what's going on in the brain. It's not just a bunch of individual surface parts, but these super networked parts. So the way to think about the brain, even though it does have some individual parts and individual cells, that's not really the point any more than asking how the internet worked. How could you access all this material? Well, it's because all these systems are interconnected, not because there's any one computer that has maps and everything on sale at Amazon and movies. You're able to do this stuff because there's information processing systems located in a whole bunch of different places that are so interconnected it's hard to even conceive of what the interconnections look like, though it's possible. Similarly, the parts of the brain are so interconnected it's hard to even conceive, but it's starting to be possible of what those interconnections look like. Which means even if you're majoring in some normal thing and leave psychology and the neurosciences, for any complex behavior, if you're in some conversation where the person says, oh, I wonder what part of the brain does that, it's quite likely there is no single part of the brain that does that. For almost anything with complexity, I mean, some things, regulate heart rate, you can identify the part of the brain that does that. But solve calculus problems when you're worried about doing well in the class and trying to remember stuff and keeping track of time, there's massive amounts of brain that are firing in a synchronized way at the same time. So those are like starter lessons. And of course, these connections also change with experience. As a point that's also obvious, once pointed out, the number of connections in the brain is gargantuan, wildly exceeds the number of genes in the genome. So it can't be the case that everything's genetically specified because there's like a computational problem. There's something like 100 billion cells. Individual neurons connect to 1,000 other ones in some cases. So there's no way to computationally put into the genome the connections in the brain system. So the connections occur in part through experience, which means that people with different experiences will have different, essentially differently wired systems of brain, even though the overall anatomy will be the same. So that's sort of what the brain is like, a flexible, plastic, muscle-like system that is like a muscle in some way, but obviously like the internet in some other way, in that it's resting on massive connections. Another one of these broad overview questions is, how do we know any of this? That is, how do scientists in the contemporary field learn what the brain does? How do we link biological structure? Oh, yes. In particular, the question here is the psychology question. How do we link biological structure to psychological function? There's lots of things you might do if and when you're in a brain anatomy class to learn about the anatomy and physiology of the brain. But note, and hopefully this won't come as a surprise to you, we're in a psychology class. So the questions here are, if we observe some bit of psychology, people have these different forms of memory. Emotions wax and wane. Sometimes people lose consciousness. The question is, for a psychology class is always, can we deepen our understanding of that psychological event by looking at the biological underpinning? So we're almost always going that way. And frankly, historically, for those of you going on in the neurosciences, that's generally what happens. And much of the contemporary work in the psychology neurosciences is actually driven by the psychology, Because if you open up a brain, there's just a bunch of cells. You can't really poke around and find, oh, which one is the second language cell? You need to first learn that, oh, people can learn a second language, and then you can use the psychological activity as a guide to what's going on in the brain. One way, this is a fun one if you can get people to be in the studies, is brain damage studies. Yes, bring people to the lab. One way to learn about the brain is through naturally occurring unfortunate events in which someone experiences brain damage. Bad for the person, but good for science. The ideal case is to find somebody who you knew something about, some brain damage occurred, then you see them immediately afterwards, and you can compare how they are now, after the brain damage, to how they were just yesterday before a rock fell out of the sky and landed on some part of their head. There are logically three possibilities if rock or penny, somebody throws a penny off the Willis Sears Tower and it goes zooming through a part of your head after it's accelerating to 300 miles an hour. There are three possibilities. One is uninteresting. You're dead. I mean, it's interesting to you, but otherwise it's not interesting for the psychology class. Another one is that it's conceivable that the parts of the brain just add brain power. It might be like the different parts are like cylinders in an engine, and something drops in there, and you lost a few, so you lost some horsepower, and everything slows down. That's not what happens, but that is possible. You can imagine an electronic system. I don't know enough about how a random access memory works in a computer system to work this out in any detail, but you can imagine one that simply slows down if you take out some of the circuitry. Another possibility, though, is that you'll lose a specific capability depending upon where exactly in your brain the penny that fell out of the, I'm sticking with this story, the penny that fell off the top of the Sears Willis Tower landed. Maybe if it landed here, you'll have trouble remembering and counting numbers. And if it landed here, you won't be able to produce speech. And if it landed there, you won't be able to see. Thank heavens we have some cases. This is by far the most famous case. This is probably, I guess without exception, this is probably the most famous individual person case in all of psychology and the neurosciences. The case of Phineas Gage. You can punch up videos about this. There's books about this guy. He's depicted in representations in science, and a neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio, who was on for a few seconds with the woman who had the amygdala problem last week, recreated through kind of computer-generated imagery exactly what happened to him in an article in Science in 1994. Let's see what happened to him. This is what newspapers used to look like. They didn't have enough ink back in the day. This is the actual Boston Post report from the 13th of September, 1848. The headline, horrible accident. Phineas Gage, foreman on the railroad in Cavendish, yesterday engaged in Lamkaya for a blast. I don't know what that word is. The powder exploded, carrying an iron instrument through his head 1 1/4 inch in circumference, and 3 feet and 8 inches in length was this iron thing that he was using at the time. So the guy is basically, to lay down railroads, they didn't go up and down every little hill. You set off a little explosion to blow up a little hill so the railroad can go in a straight line, and you put the explosives down there by putting them down and tamping them down. One possibility is that when you tamp them down, they blow up, and an iron pipe goes through your head. The iron centered on the side of his face, shattering the upper jaw, passing through the back of the left side. The most singular circumstance connected with this melancholy affair is that he was alive at 2 o'clock this afternoon and in full possession of his, whatever that is. He was fine, sort of, and free of pain. Oh, that's his actual skull. I think it's at Harvard. I think there's a museum at Harvard that has his skull, and that's a recreation of what he would be like if you saw him. There's pictures of him, too. The book has there's like one picture of the guy post-accident. The interesting thing is this. A, he didn't die. B, he did not seem slow and less intelligent. It says here, not dead, not slower and less intelligent. Yet, he was not the same person. Then suddenly there's these reports, but what's interesting here is that they're real physician reports. Like this didn't happen in the middle of nowhere 800 years ago. It was in Boston at a time where people had newspapers. Physicians report, now the guy is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in gross profanity, not previously his custom, impatient, devising plans which are no sooner arranged than they're abandoned for others. Previous to his injury, although untrained in the schools like yourselves, he possessed a well-balanced mind and was looked upon by those who knew him as a shrewd, smart businessman. This guy was like a foreman. He wasn't even just like a regular worker. He was the guy in charge of the other workers. In this regard, his mind was radically changed, so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. He had a personality change. He changed in these descriptive qualities of personality theory. He became less conscientious. In the language of psychoanalytic theory, which, yes, is kind of screwy, but sometimes gives you useful language, like the superego functionings fell apart. The parts where you have moral rules, or in the language of the social cognitive theories of personality, where you have standards for behavior and regulate your behavior according to these standards, so that if you don't like somebody, you don't really start cursing at them like crazy all the time. That stuff is what got blown to bits. He could still speak. No problem. He could understand people. For a while, he stayed on his job until he just kept getting into arguments with people. He lost the ability to control his social emotions according to the rules of society, and relatedly couldn't plan. In some of the functions that we called working memory, in the memory section, you keep in mind your goals and what you're supposed to do, they got blown apart by the pipe, even though a lot of the rest of it was, the brain was clearly functioning fine. So part 4, from the previous part, brain changes with experience. We saw that with the taxi drivers. It's like a tool. It's flexible. People didn't used to drive taxis during the course of evolution. The Capgras syndrome, the parts are not connected, and therefore you get this weirdo stuff. And now, though, there are subparts that are specialized. That is not known only from the Phineas Gage study. There's millions of examples like that, and you'll see them throughout the chapter of the textbook. But the Phineas Gage study was historically the first thing that made people realize, oh, there must be a part of the brain involved in regulating your emotions and behavior according to social rules, because the guy lost that and had everything else. Which means that different parts of the brain, even though they're interconnected, these different subparts do different things. So the portrait of the brain is that there is n, where n is pretty large number of subparts. They do different things. Complex behavior involves a networking of multiple parts, and the way the network is networked can change with experience, as can, in essence, the muscular strength of the parts, which is a complex story, but it's the brain. There's no simple story that captures that at all. There are other techniques, though. Fortunately, modern neuroscience does not involve just shooting stuff through people's brains. A second technique that's actually quite valuable, even though it's kind of simple-minded compared to the third one, is called EEG, or if you have more time and spelling abilities, electroencephalography. What EEG, the idea here, why EEG works is because the individual brain cells have an electrical property from something you learn in a chemistry class, where there's ions that have an electrical charge. They go in and out of a cell, and if there's 100 billion cells, there's some electrical activity there. Interestingly enough, that if you want to record the activity, although you could open up the skull and stick in some electronic recording device, you also, as we've seen, I think, already in the consciousness chapter, can just put on this funny hat. Because there's so much electrical activity, the electrical activity can be picked up by electrodes outside of the skull. This technique has been around since much of the 20th century, yet it's useful for a lot of things. I'll mention a second finding. Here's a simple finding that's not at all obvious until the person found it. Before we get to that educational excitement, though, there's one last bit of readings and their reduction. So keep in mind, Sooner or later, there'll be the course evaluation forms. What a great class. He kept reducing the readings. The syllabus says this. You can see the problem already. This was week 14, but we're on this topic here. That means when we get to week 15, we'll be on that topic there. That means there's a problem because there's no week 16. So the implication of there being no week 16, notice that I saved myself the effort of doing this by actually drawing it in on the PowerPoint, is that we're just not going to get to nature, nurture, and their interaction. I had some fear in August that it was conceivable that would happen. Fear might be an overstatement. That's sort of okay in that sense that if you go on in psychology, you'll take a course that will revisit the genetics of behavior, otherwise something went wrong at your educational institution, which couldn't possibly happen here. So you'll see this again. It is kind of unfortunate that we're not getting there, but we're not getting the sensation and perception is a super core topic in psychology, both in terms of people finding things and for those of you majoring, things you need to learn because somebody will ask you on a test 4 years from now if you want to go to graduate school. That's more true for nature than it is for nature, nurture, and their interaction, I believe. So for the purposes of the exam, there won't be anything whatsoever on nature, nurture, and their interaction. That means that the final exam, again, might have 45 questions instead of 50 because I'm cutting out a little bit of material. But again, quite seriously, I'm trying to avoid having us go totally stir-crazy by speeding up at the end of the semester, having remembered classes where the person did that and then everyone failed. And, well, that seemed less good for the student. So what we're doing is that stuff that was at the beginning, a tour, so to speak, of parts of the brain. I'll preview, I will preview by saying this is not really an anatomy class. I'm not just going to say there are these parts of the brain and we'll all memorize them. The parts of the brain are interesting in a psychology class because there are some distinctive psychological functions. And what happens is when you tour around the brain, you run into, in this case, for this class, 2 or 3 of the strangest and therefore informative oddities of the entire world of psychology occur in this class. So first, there's one now. Apparently, that's what the brain is like there at National Geographic. It looks kind of like that if you made the terrible mistake of taking it out. I guess you'd only get it part of the way out. And then you will notice, though this is not the main learning point for today, that it's wrinkly. I'm sure everybody's seen some picture like this of the brain before. The first thing you kind of notice is that it's not smooth but wrinkly. The wrinkly serves a particular function. If you stretch this out and flatten it out, the upper surface, or cortex, would be 2.5 square feet. I carefully did the calculations when writing the textbook. So your head would have to be, 1.5 feet wide or something if it was flat, and then